Don Hijar was born in Sugar City, Colorado, down in the lower Arkansas River Valley, and he was raised on the family's sugar beet farm. So how perfect is that? He has worked and served in the ag community for over 45 years and is no stranger to hard work and dedication that it takes to manage and maintain agricultural lands. Don entered the seed industry in 1984, and he founded Pawnee Buttes Seed in 1998, which is based in Greeley. He has been the past president of Colorado Seed Industry Association, the Associated Landscape Contractors of Colorado, and the Colorado section of the Society for Range Management. So Don is going to share with us some proven principles that can improve drought forage resilience and productivity over the long term. So Don, unfortunately, drought is certainly a topic of discussion, not just in the ag community, but around the state for municipalities and industries as well. For us in ag, trying to adapt to less water and more heat is something that it looks like we're going to need to be focusing on. So I'm eager to hear what you have to say about that and about how we might be able to become more resilient in the face of changing climatic and runoff conditions.
Phil, thank you very much. The major things about Colorado that stand out to me is, you have the Eastern Plains. That's way different than, say, the San Luis Valley. That is way different than North Park. And you have South Park, Middle Park. All those areas are pretty dry. The San Luis Valley is only 4 to 7 inches of precip. So without irrigation, they don't produce much grass on there, if you want to call it native rangeland. But the things that out in eastern Colorado that make a big difference are soils. If you're on a clay or a loamy range site, you'll have way different kind of grasses than you will on sandy range sites. So the production is way different. But how all this applies to irrigated land is that no one grass is going to be the grass that to plant in Colorado that's going to solve everybody's problems. In the lower Arkansas Valley, they got a lot of alkalinity problems, and there's alkali in the soils, and then they have to water with alkali water, and the situation just gets worse as you get further down the river towards Kansas. And the South Platte is kind of experiencing the same kind of challenges with a lot of alkalinity along the Platte. So I think of those things that Colorado is so diverse because of elevation differences, 3,500 feet all the way up to 14,000. And when you're up there in North Park, you're probably around 8,000 feet. It's a lot colder. You got a real short growing season. They don't even grow alfalfa up there. So you got some big differences. And so when we're talking about irrigated pastures or irrigated haylands, management's going to be different. The species are going to be different. How much you can water and how you water is going to be different. So all of that will affect what you ultimately end up planting. I do want to talk a little bit about drought. That in my experience, seems like this is the worst I have seen native grasses throughout the state, and even irrigated pasture grasses have taken its toll. The drought, this chart kind of shows you how bad it is up there in Phillips County. It looks like it's about the worst in the state, but all of eastern Colorado is in pretty severe drought. And there's only a small area of the state that is not considered being in the drought. I like what Nolan Deskin, the climatologist, said about drought. He said, you don't know when it's coming until you're in it, and you don't know when it's gone until you're out of it. And so it's really kind of hard to predict exactly when it's going to come. We all know that we kind of get them every 10 years and a worse one every 20 years and then a real bad one every 30 years, but you still can't predict exactly when it's going to hit. The reason I said extensive drought has a multiplier effect is because we're so oriented and to think that all the water comes from the snow melt. And a lot of irrigation, that's where it comes from. But what about areas that aren't irrigated? They have to rely on rainfall or snowfall. And so a lot of irrigated areas should be thinking about that. How do you capitalize on the snowfall or the rainfall that you do get? Not just thinking about, well, I got to irrigate it. I'm gonna get 4 runs this year of water, or I'm only going to get 1. I think it's important that we start thinking more like a dry land farmer. How do we farm the moisture? So anyway, the drought is none of us like it. We all have to put up with it, whether you irrigate or you're a dry land farmer. It still affects you. On my little 12-acre meadow, normally I was getting 500 to 600 bales, and this year I got 125 small bales. So that's a considerable reduction. And I know, and I've talked to a lot of different people about their situations, and some people that usually get 4 runs of water or 5 maybe got 1. And one fellow that I was talking to with a center pivot, he said he usually could water most of May, June, July, and August, and he was only able to water 1 time. So not very good. One of the things I forgot to mention on that last slide is what's really important to think about and understand is what is your mean annual precip. And most of eastern Colorado is somewhere like 12 to 14. Where I grew up, I didn't even know this when I was growing up, but we were only in a 7 to 11 inch precip area. And how that made a difference is there was no dry land farming in our area. And that's a pretty big area. It kind of goes from Colorado Springs out in a bell-shaped curve to Los Animas, and then from there all the way back down to Trinidad. And then, like I said earlier, San Luis Valley only gets 4 to 7 inches of mean annual precip. So you got to learn to work with what you got, but it's good to know what you're starting with. We can go to the next slide. So irrigated pasture. I think what most people want, and I've talked to, I think, literally thousands of people by now. Everybody wants a palatable grass, which is understandable, but a lot of times they put that as the most important characteristic that they want. And a lot of times productivity is more important than that. And sometimes a species that is not as palatable will outperform the one that is palatable. And so I kind of like to think of it this way. Palatability versus productivity versus adaptability. If you plant something that's not real adaptable, you might love that grass. You might have all kinds of experience with it, but if it's not adaptable for that site, you're working against yourself. Reason I mentioned there's no magic grass is I got to use an example. Back in the 90s, when corn got real cheap, there was a lot of center pivot people that decided they were going to grow irrigated grass under intensive management, produce, beef and do that. And there was a grass that came from, it was actually native to Argentina, but the New Zealanders had found it. They took it back to New Zealand, bred it, developed it, and they named the grass Matua. And it started selling all over the United States. And it was like, when I heard about it, it was too good to be true. And I never believed in the grass, but essentially it could grow on dry land. It could grow on wet areas. You could put 400 to 500 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre, and you could run 4,000 pounds of beef per acre on it. And everybody was selling it everywhere. And after about 5 years, when people started finding out what its shortcomings were, I haven't sold any. I haven't even heard of anybody talking about it now for 20 years. So that's why I wanted to mention that. Sometimes somebody will come up with the miracle grass, and it's really not a miracle grass. It's just a marketing ploy. So you need to select the right grass for your project. That's very important. So what are some of the key factors of variegated pasture management? I think probably the number one factor is how well can you water that area? And I know that sounds kind of odd, but you'd be surprised how, I mean, irrigation water management, as the NRCS calls it, is really important. How efficient can you put the water? Can you apply that water to that piece of ground that you're trying to grow grass on? And if you don't have a good way to efficiently apply it, well, then you're going to waste a lot of water. But even more than that, what I've seen, in a lot of mountain meadows, and it's no fault of anybody, but they're not nice and flat. They're hilly, they're undulating, they go up and down. So you have areas that get too much water, and you have areas that are real high and don't get any water. And where they get too much water, it kills out the grass you want. And then eventually what the people up in the mountains call it is wiregrass takes over, which is either some kind of sedge or rush. And a lot of those sedges and rushes are not very palatable. They're not very nutritious either. And it's hard to put them up and have good quality hay. So being able to really water your field efficiently is important for production and good quality hay and save water. But probably the second most important thing is, how are you managing that pasture if you are using it? Is it a pasture or is it hayland? I like to ask people, what's more important? Is the hay more important that you produce off of that, or is the grazing more important? And the reason is that sometimes you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. And if you end up, for example, if you hay something and you cut it real short and it doesn't have time to come back very much, and then you put a bunch of animals on there, that is very, very hard on that grass. And even though it may come back next year, the amount of hay that it's going to produce is not going to be as much. So if the hay production is more important, maybe you shouldn't graze it at all, or you should think about how to graze it differently. The thing that I think about also is cover. If you have cover on there going through the winter and it snows on it, it's very likely that all that snow that you receive on that piece of pasture is going to stay there. It's going to melt, and it's going to go in to the ground, and it's not going to evaporate. The more cover you have, the less evaporation you have. So that's utilizing the moisture that you get from Mother Nature, from the sky, snow or rain. Stock density. Everybody knows about stock density. We've been talking about that for years and years. And yet that is, nowadays they call it mob grazing. Well, there's probably old timers that think of, hey, we've been doing that for a long time. But the idea is, if you're going to put a lot of animals on a piece of ground, you do it for a very short period of time, but then you got to give it plenty of time to recover. And it's not just putting a bunch of them on there and leaving them there for a long time. So comparing continuous grazing to rotational grazing to intensive grazing, the whole thing of it is working with the way the plant grows and giving it a chance to recuperate and producing another crop. So what's the impacts of management? I think that I'm going to use the example of smooth brome and Kentucky bluegrass. Those are a lot of times the species up in the mountains that become really sod bound. In my experience with mountain pastures from here up to Montana, that there are some mountain pastures that can produce 3 to 5 tons per acre per year, good water, a little bit of fertility. And I have seen some of those same kind of pastures only produce 0.5 ton per acre per year. Probably part of it is not good, a good way to apply the water, but a lot of times what it is they become sod bound. And sod bound is where the roots are so dense, so thick that those plants are drawing from the same nutrients, and they just can't produce that much. And one of the things that I'd like to mention is way back in '75, when I started working for the SCS in Hijar, there was a, I think they call it the High Mountain Meadow Research Center in Gunnison. And it had been there. I don't know how long it had been there at that time, maybe 25 years. But a guy by the name of Gene Seymour was the fellow that operated it. And there was only one reason it was there, was to try to help producers, landowners up in the mountains produce more hay on their irrigated meadows. And the problem was sod-bound conditions. So they tried everything. Gene, I think, worked there about 25 years or longer. And then Dr. Joe Brummer worked there for a period of time, and then they closed the facility down. So the problem hasn't gone away, but the research that, all of the research that was done, it's gone. There's not that facility up there anymore. But the issue is that, and so what did they try to do? They tried to do some interseeding. But before I get to interseeding, sorry, they tried to do different things that were easy. Fertilizer. All right, fertilizer is going to help. But if you got something that's only producing 0.5 ton or 1 ton per acre, all the fertilizer in the world isn't going to change it that much. It might increase it. Well, say you take something that's 0.5 ton per acre and you double it. That's still not very good. 1 ton per acre production, you can do a lot better than that up on those mountain meadows. And aeration, there's been studies done about aerating, and it's not usually worth the money. So you get maybe a little bit of increase in production, but not much. So those two things are not the best way to do it. The next one is fire. I don't think fire should ever be used in Colorado because we do not have that much cover, and cover means that you're going to protect it from wind erosion, and lack of cover means you're going to have some wind erosion. But the other thing is, lack of cover is, or I should put it a different way. If you have good cover, then you have the potential to capture that snow, keep it on that field, and it'll melt, go into the ground, and now you're adding to your profile, your moisture profile. So in this dry climate, anything you do to remove the cover is you're working against yourself because you're not retaining the moisture that falls from the sky. So I don't believe in burning it. All the burning does in the spring is you're getting rid of this dry matter, and it looks like the field greens up quicker. It's just a more of an aesthetic thing than it is increasing your production. It really doesn't do that. So Gene Seymour spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to interseed. And he even did it to the point where he talked to John Deere, and John Deere built a prototype grass drill. And instead of having just a double disc opener that was based on weight and it would turn the double discs, they actually put power to those double discs. They would spin and cut, and then they drop the seed in that little groove. And sometimes those grasses would germinate, but they hardly ever got established because what was there was way too much competition for what you wanted. And he tried a lot of different grasses, like he tried to interseed Timothy into some of those fields, also red top. And we found out orchard grass doesn't work up there very well because it's not very winter hardy. And so that you can plant it, it can come up, maybe you'll have it for a year, maybe two, but eventually it goes out in a lot of those high meadows. And so we have found out that interseeding in Colorado for the most part doesn't work. It's just too much competition. The other thing that creates an issue up in the mountains is that a lot of ranchers don't have the equipment they need to really work up the ground or do a good job of interseeding. So the thing that I would like to propose is start all over again. And that's a tough one. And it's tough because ranchers up in the mountains aren't farmers. They don't have tillage equipment. And I have actually been involved in a few projects where somebody from down here at our elevation will take their equipment up there, work up an 80-acre field or whatever, and plant it and start it all over again. But boy, that's expensive. And it's the mobilization. That's a big thing. And if it's a 5-day project, then, you know, they're going to charge you for staying out overnight and then room and board and the whole thing. But it is something to consider. In order to really do a good job, you got to do a good job of killing what's there. And I am sure there's guys that have tried it many times to interseed with different things, different methods. And at best, it's a short-term kind of a venture. So these pictures kind of indicate what you need. You need to work up a seed bed that looks kind of like that one. And the guide is that you don't want any soil clods to be more than 1 inch in diameter. So you might have to work it up 3 times, 5 times, whatever. The thing that I have seen in 48 years is the approach to planting grass for a lot of people is way different than a guy that's going to plant corn or sugar beets. Why people think you can do one application, one cultivation, plant your grass, and you're going to get a good stand, I don't know, but it doesn't work. You have to get rid of the competition. You got to create a firm seed bed. And so when you have a sod down condition, you might have to moldboard plow it or or use a big disc plow to turn it over so that the roots are up and the grass is down. And then you might have to plant an annual crop like oats for a couple of years. And that way, if you get a bunch of weeds in there or some of that old grass that was there starting to come back, you can disc it up, plow it up, and work it up again. But you're not losing production because you're going to grow a oat crop. You can grow an oat crop or something like that for hay for a couple of years, and then go into plant a grass that is adaptable for your situation. Some of the things to consider when you're going to plant grass, when you're going to select a certain species is, the topography, the soil type. In eastern Colorado, under the Conservation Reserve Program, there are two major mixes. One is for loamy soils or heavier hard soils, and the other one is for sand. And the mixes are quite different. And so I think under irrigation, there's times that we're not looking hard enough at the soil to get the right grass for your area. But then the other one is irrigation. How much irrigation do you have? When I started in the seed industry, people would call and ask about, well, I want to plant grass. And I'd ask them, is it irrigated or dry land? And I thought I was asking enough. And if they said irrigated, then I'd recommend what we typically would think of as irrigated grass species. But I learned that there's a third area. So you're either dry land or you're irrigated, but then there's an area in between, which I call limited irrigation. If a fella can irrigate from say March 1st all the way up to November 1st, all he wants, then there's a lot of things he can grow. But if he doesn't get water in until June 1st, then at our elevation here in Greeley, March, April, and May, if it happens to be a very dry spring, then there's certain grasses that will really suffer. You'll actually lose some stand during that period because you're not getting any moisture on it. So it's limited. You're limited either in the number of times you can irrigate or the amount of water you have, period. And so you have to pick different species. You can't pick those great species that can grow for 8 or 9 months down here at this elevation. The other thing is drainage. If you got poor drainage, and up in the mountains, there's areas you have poor drainage. And so you might use something like creeping meadow foxtail. It can take real wet areas. It has its challenges, but it can grow in those areas, and it's a lot better than what a lot of people call wiregrass. Then you have areas that are very alkali. And when you get into alkali areas, it doesn't matter whether you like it or not, you got to plant what'll grow there. Because if you plant other things that won't grow there, they're just not going to work. And I've seen that done a lot of times. How are we doing on time? We're doing all right?
Yep.
Yep. All right, good. You go to the next one. So let's talk a little bit about drought tolerant species. Some of the typical irrigated pasture grasses are orchard grass, brome grass, tall fescue, and once in a while somebody might put intermediate in there. But what I like to look at is kind of divide them between cool season species and warm season species. Pubescent wheatgrass, intermediate, slender, green needlegrass, meadow brome, Russian wild rye. Those varieties can produce well on irrigated ground, and they're way more drought tolerant than smooth brome, and they won't get sod bound. Tall fescue is very productive, but it has an endophyte in it. And in Missouri, for example, where they have almost solid stands of tall fescue, they have what they call fescue foot, because it's a vasoconstrictor. And so therefore that it doesn't get blood to the extremities like they should. And so they'll lose the tips of their ear, they'll lose their tail, the tips of their tail, but then eventually it starts affecting their feet, and they can die from it. So there's not a whole lot of tall fescue used in Colorado as a straight species or a monostand. You will see it sometimes planted with orchard grass and maybe a little bit of perennial rye. But the tall fescue it's not that drought tolerant, and orchard grass is not that winter hardy. And they have theoretically some drought tolerant orchard grasses, but those drought tolerant orchard grasses are no comparison to pubescent and intermediate wheatgrass. So the wheat grasses are palatable. They are nutritious. They can do a good job for you. I know horse people, they have a real prejudice. They like bromes in orchards. And if somebody has good enough water and good soils that aren't real alkali or real wet, those are great grasses to plant. We use meadow brome rather than smooth brome on our irrigated pasture mixes. Warm season species, they do best in the summer, as you might well think, and that's true. They do the best in the summer. And warm season species for up in the mountains just doesn't make sense, because your growing season is real short, and so you pretty much have to plant cool season species so that they can grow as long as it's possible. Cool season species start growing when the soil temperatures are 45 degrees, and warm seasons start growing about 60 degrees. So like at our elevation, cool seasons will start growing March the 1st, and warm seasons might start the middle of May. So if, for example, somebody only had an irrigated right to water, let's say June, July, and August, well, warm seasons would make a lot of sense, because they could really take advantage of the heat and the water during that time of the year. And so some of those warm season species are switchgrass, big blue stem, Indian grass. Those three can produce a lot of forage. Big blue stem Indian grass can get 6 foot tall. Sand blue stem, if you're going to use it, you would use it more on sandy areas. Prairie sandreed can grow on loamy soils and on sand under irrigation. And switchgrass can grow on both places too, loamy and sandy. Side oats grama, I threw that out there because it is not a tall grass, but it's pretty productive. It establishes quick. All of these can make good hay, and you can pasture them using good pasture principles. Well, there you have it. I'm happy to try to answer any questions or have any discussion. Um,
Well, thanks, Don. So we're going to go ahead and open it up for questions now. And we've got one question in the chat. And what I would say is our group is not huge. So I think we can go ahead, and if people have questions they just want to voice, just go ahead and unmute yourself and you can ask that question. But we'll start with this one here in the chat. And the question is, Don, at what elevation would you say warm seasons start not making sense?
That's a good question. What I like to think about is going from Kansas into Colorado. Of course, you enter into the plains, and there's a lot of species in eastern Colorado that grow in Kansas, and especially western Kansas. But when you get to I-25, essentially all the way from the Trinidad all the way up to Cheyenne, when you get west of I-25, you hit the foothills, and the foothills are a mixture of mountain grass species and the prairie species. It's the transition zone. And I have found some of the warm seasons species at 8,000 feet, heck, as high as 9,000 feet. But I would say that really, when you get to the foothills, that's a place to think about using from there. As you start picking up elevation from the foothills west, you start using more cool season species.
So speaking of the mountains and the cool seasons and the colder weather, colder temperatures that they experienced, on you and I had a previous conversation on winter kill, and sometimes there's a misconception about what winter kill is and is not. Can you speak to that a little bit?
You bet. There's when I got in the seed business, people would buy different alfalfa varieties, and alfalfa, they kind of rate them on winter hardiness and fall dormancy. So the more something is fall dormant, typically the more winter hardy it is. That's the way alfalfa works. So a variety like Ladak alfalfa is extremely winter hardy, might be the most winter hardy variety out there, but it's slower to get started in the spring, and it quits growing earlier in the fall. So its production potential, you might say, might be less because it has a shorter growing season, but it's way more winter hardy. Well, what I learned from with alfalfa is, and we all do it, when we're going to cut alfalfa for hay, I mean, we just cut it right down to the ground, and it comes back very quick. Usually you can cut it again in 28 to 32 days. Well, that's all fine and good, but that last cutting, if it doesn't have time to come back and it's real short like that, the crown is exposed. And so it's not just being cold, but it's really desiccation that kills it. Our winds actually hit that exposed flesh, if you want to call it that green, and can kill that plant. And it can do the same thing to grasses. The shorter you have the grasses going into the winter, the more susceptible they're going to be to winter kill. So it's not just cold, it's wind desiccation.
Yeah, Paul Bruchez, go ahead with your question. If you got one there, you got a hand raised.
Thanks, Phil. Don, thanks so much for this. I really appreciate it. And I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but maybe something for thinking about longer term. As you talk about these seed beds, when we're looking at this start over, and you and I have spoken recently about this, but when we're targeting that, with any kind of farm application of everything from mower plows to discs to what we're really looking at doing and ripping the ground, is there a general thought about depth? And I realize that soil really matters. Is it more of a root zone depth that we're trying to manipulate the sod, or is it that connectivity between the topsoil and the mineral soil that we're really trying to add connection to, or is it just getting rid of that initial surface grass? I mean, what would be any thoughts on that? And again, not to put you on the spot, but that I think that as people we're looking at more arid climates and areas that used to have a wetter footprint, and we're looking at this transition, you know, we're desperately seeking kind of that best management practice, even if it is a start over within the soil.
Right. Yeah, I think if you're going to plow it, you probably need to plow it 6 to 8 inches deep. And then once you've plowed it, of course, you're going to bring up big clods and you got sod, you know, and so you got to cut it up with a disc. That's what a disc does. And then you'll have to use another piece of equipment to break it up a little bit more. But the plow, it flips it upside down, right? I mean, that plant, and that's the idea of it. And that's what's going to kill it. I mean, that's what we had to do when we were farming beets. We always rotated our beets with corn and alfalfa. And when you try to kill alfalfa, you had to deep plow it like that. Otherwise, you'd still have a lot of it coming back. And smooth brome and Kentucky bluegrass are really bad about that. If you don't turn them over, then it's going to be tough to kill it. You know, I'm sure there's other ways that you could reduce the stand that you have, but because it's a sod former, whatever's left is going to come back with a vengeance. That's the problem. I had a customer one time that said, Don, I know what you're telling me is right, but he says, I got this crappy ground on the Republican River and I got this old center pivot and I just don't want to plow it up. Tell me what I can do. So I had him graze the daylights out of it for like 2 months, and he just pounded into the ground. I said, can you make it look like a baseball field? And he said, yeah, I can do that. I says, all right, we'll do that. So he grazed it really, really hard. Then after he grazed it hard, I said, I want you to water it, because he had a sprinkler. He watered it once, it started coming up, and then he hit it with Roundup, and he got a good kill. But Roundup, in my experience, is never 100%. And I told the customer that, and he understood it, and he then planted. He went in there and planted his grass that he wanted, and he got a great stand. He was so happy. I was too. But in 2 years, you could start seeing the smooth brome, because he had smooth brome mania. It started coming back. And if you with somebody that with poor management, that smooth brome would come back even quicker. So there's other ways to do things, but Roundup is just not 100%. And when you got a sod former, it's going to come back.
Yeah, I appreciate that. We've seen it in some transition meadows too, where it's not only irrigation practice, but also feeding other hay sources on it. If you're feeding hay that has smooth brome in it, that stuff loves to come and grow. Also for this, and I've talked to Phil about this, and I think the rest of the crowd would be interested too. If we're looking at that farming transition as far as some kind of a summer follow or order of process about what that's going to look like, if we're not using chemical treatments and we're looking more for how it's going to happen with our short growth seasons, would there be a general recommendation for amount of time that you're giving, flipping the sod, busting it into seed beds and really giving that soil a chance to break down, with the sod mat that's in there? Is there a given recommendation that you would have? And again, not, on the spot, but something to think about.
Well, there's a couple of ways to do it. One of them is if you break it up in the fall, right? Say you plowed it up in the fall, and let's say you left it in that condition. You just plow it once and leave it in that condition, then Mother Nature's going to help break it down more. But you're still going to have to work it up in the spring to prepare a firm seed bed. And then and timing is so important, Paul, because once you prepare that seed bed, you need to plant your grass very soon. Your last operation, then you plant your grass the next day. Because when when you plant your grass, or no, I should put it this way, the last tillage operation you do begins the clock on weeds that are going to start growing. And so if you wait 5 days after your last tillage operation, those weeds have a 5-day start before the grass. So that's why timing is so important, because you want your grass seed, when you put it in the ground, to have the same opportunity to start growing as the weeds, that seed that's in there, because it's in there.
So I'm sorry, and after this I'll be quiet because I'm sure there's other questions, but we have not ever tried and interested in doing it this year. We didn't accomplish anything in the fall to soil manipulate. And so we're looking to maybe do something in the spring, and something that's interesting that's happening within the Colorado River system conservation is coming back. And so producers will likely have the opportunity to perhaps get paid for a season of foregoing irrigation. And if that opens a window to look at this transition, that's maybe a little bit different than historically has been available for an opportunity. If you look at soil sod manipulation in spring through the summer, have the summer season help. I know the weed mitigation will be the challenge, but then getting into fall where we're finalizing, and then up in the Kremmling-area elevation, we've been very successful at frost plantings or fall plantings. What would be your thoughts on that, with starting the process in the spring, summer breakdown, and then a fall planting?
Yeah, I think you could actually work it up. When could you start working it up? Like April 15th?
In most years, definitely.
Yep. So if you could start working it up and get that done in 3 to 5 days, from the start to the finish, then you can plant something like oats. The reason I'm saying that is, okay, if you start getting a flush of broadleaf weeds, you could spray it with a pretty inexpensive chemical like 2,4-D, kill your weeds, your broadleaf weeds, but you're still going to grow an oat crop, cut your oat crop and for hay. And then you could plant your seed, your grass seed, right into that oat stubble. It would almost be a perfect seed bed.
Thank you, Don. I love it. You just made my dad very happy hearing that, I'm sure.
All right.
I just got a question for Paul Bruchez. I know that you guys over there in Kremmling have been doing a lot of work with drought-resistant species in the last couple of years. Can you just maybe briefly say what has been successful in terms of species, and also what has been successful in terms of tillage to bring forth those crops? I don't see us doing any plowing in North Park for the reason that there's a bunch of boulders right down there that it's going to get in our way.
So one of the very intelligent advisors to the efforts of my family was the man that presented today. So I think you just heard a lot of the advice from Don. So our bigger meadow that we did years ago that was successful, it was a very sod-bound condition meadow, and we did just straight up farm it. And then the species that Don listed there pretty much were what we planted, and it is continued to be very successful over time. More recently, we're trying with other stuff, and we're doing very small scale, Phil, because we're trying to really figure out how this stuff works. And so we have had quite a bit of success doing a couple passes with a rototiller and leaving the bigger equipment out. But again, doing it at small scale, that sounds really dreamy, doing it at a larger scale. But the point being with the rototiller is we're not going as deep to pull up a lot of the rocks and pull up a lot of that stuff. We did some plantings where we did no tillage and interseeded, as Don said. We did not chemical treat, but we dried out the meadows for a summer season, very heavily grazed them, and then interseeded. And it's the painful life of being an ag producer. It was all of the meadows that were not under very severe sod-bound conditions and deeper rooting, more clump grass species. The interseed worked very well in that application, but that's not necessarily where we really needed it. And the sod-bound stuff, if we're not rototilling or disking, to a full seed bed or chemical treating, we've had very limited success of anything with the sod-bound. And it's exactly what Don said, is it's exciting because you get some of that stuff to germinate, but those old existing plants just choke it out. So we keep working on it, and anybody on this that's not familiar with it, there is an alternative Forages working group, that's having this conversation frequently and bringing other people in, and Don will be part of that conversation. We're all working on it. So hopefully more information to come. Additional test plots went in this year in a number of different places this fall. So it'll be exciting to see what happened. And again, soil manipulation and treatment in different ways. So we'll keep everybody posted the best that we can.
Paul, at what month did you interseed?
So we've done fall interseeding October, late October and November. We also tried a May interseeding, and it was really the May interseeding worked surprisingly well. But again, it's kind of the sod-bound condition stuff. We had some stuff germinate. It was all exciting. And then a year later choked out. The fall stuff that occurred where we more have clump grasses, deeper rooters, continues to work, and it's great. And again, fall, spring, it both worked. I think for us, it's, if we hit that frost planting just right, where we get it in the soil and then you get a nice snow cover for the year, it always seems to be our best. But you're playing with forecasts and Mother Nature to hit that spot on. And when we do it right, that always seems to be the best for me.
Have you seen any success with a light rate of glyphosate on bunch grasses? So that just hitting it with Roundup once and then interseeding in bunch grasses, might that work?
I don't have a good answer for that. I could guess, but I don't want to do that. Paul, do you have any experience with that?
Not really, Phil. And I think as a point of contact for that, Brandon with the Land Institute, they've worked with that so much. I think that would be a good point of contact. I think I'm like Don, is I would be saying things that are probably not accurate enough to say.
Don, one thing I wanted to ask you is, I know Paul has experimented with, kind of a wide variety of sort of companion crops or cover crops in conjunction with trying to reestablish pastures. So on both of those fronts, you mentioned oats. Are there, I guess, first question, are there companion crops that help, when you're restarting a pasture, that kind of help those new plants get started and get established, but then that you can easily knock out when you want to? And then the second would be, have you found that there are any particular cover crops that you can work in there? That you mentioned oats again, but others that kind of expand the soil or help to prepare the soil for these new species that you're going to try to get established?
Well, that's a good question. Companion crops or nurse crops, they can be good and they can be bad. The reason they can be good is like planting, say, alfalfa in the San Luis Valley. It's cold and it's a short growing season. And if you put a little bit of oats with alfalfa, say 10 to 20 pounds to the acre, and maybe they're planting their alfalfa at 15 to 25 pounds to the acre. And of course, alfalfa seed's way smaller. So your ratio of alfalfa, which is the crop that you want, to this nurse crop is real heavy, which is good. But that nurse crop, it comes up quicker and it gets taller, faster. And so I've seen it where a fella, especially on sandy soils, if I've seen it where they've planted without a nurse crop and the wind was so hard, it actually cut those little alfalfa plants off right at the ground level. So a companion crop can prevent that because it'll be taller, hard, a little bigger, thicker, and can protect those little plants. So there's people that will plant oats with alfalfa all the time, and then there's other people that they're only going to plant straight alfalfa. So that same concept could apply to grass. As long as you don't overdo it, then it can be a good thing. But on irrigated ground, I recommend 10 to 20 pounds and never over 30. So of oats when you're planting that with grass. And if you start planting it over 30 pounds, then it's way too much competition. And so what you're trying to get established is fighting against this annual crop. And as far as other like cover crops, you know, to build up the soil, peas, Austrian winter peas would probably do okay at those higher elevations, and dwarf Essex rape would probably do okay up there. Hairy vetch, and I would think radishes could grow up there. Radishes and turnips. So there's other items that you could use to theoretically build up the soil, or, you know, put down a deeper root. But if you're gonna do those, Phil, the earlier you could plant them to give them a longer growing season, because you're already in a short growing season. So you need to plant them as early as possible without getting them killed by a late frost in the spring or an early frost in the fall.
And it sounds like a good mix of brassicas and legumes is kind of the way to go to get different types of benefits.
Yeah, I think if somebody worked it up in the spring and planted a crop of oats and then these other brassicas and legumes, and then harvested it in the fall, and then did it one more year, that would help too. That would help give them an opportunity to clean up that ground, so to speak, you know. So that way, when they plant their grass, it's just going to be a lot less weed competition.
Yeah. So I guess the theme that I'm really hearing from you, Don, through this whole discussion is that it might not be a bad idea to look at this as a multi-year project, rather than trying to think that you're going to do this in 1 year. Your success is going to be probably a lot greater if you look at this as a 2-year project, and then so you're going to spend 2 years really in that sort of intercessionary period, or that intermediate period where you're going from what you had and you're trying to get rid of to what you want to establish, right?
Yeah, and it just gives you time to assess the weed situation and how much of what you try to get rid of is coming back. Because, you know, and if you get to see it for 1 year, you'll have a lot better idea of what's going on, you know. So do you need to be more drastic in your cultivation, or, you know, do you need more application of Roundup or something, you know? I think this is funny. Now, you guys probably not going to think it's funny. It's not a joke, but under the Conservation Reserve Program, which started like in 85, 86, we were allowed to plant smooth brome on the producer, the landowner was allowed to plant smooth brome. Well, after 10 years, then they could re-up that and put that back in the program in CRP and get their lease agreements. Well, but after 10 years, out here in the West, they decided, NRCS and whoever else was in power, decided that they wanted more natives, and so they didn't want the smooth brome. So the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, they came out with a little instruction that said, this is what you do. And this is the part that I think is funny. This is how you get rid of smooth brome. This was on dry land. You spray it with Roundup. You wait about 2 months to see what's coming up. Oh, you still got smooth brome. You spray it again. You wait another 2 months. And now I'm making up the rest of it. But essentially, it was, you spray it and you keep spraying it with Roundup like 4 or 5 times until you killed it. Well, that says something to me. Roundup doesn't work that dang good. Not on a perennial crop. And so I say it's never 100%. So if you think you're going to get rid of Roundup or smooth brome by just spraying it with Roundup, It's not gonna happen.
Well, this has been great, Don. There's a lot more we could talk about. I certainly have more questions. I'm sure a lot of people do as well. And to that point, I suspect you don't mind if people contact you with specific questions.
No, and Phil, I'd like to work with you and Paul mentioned that other organization, whatever it's called, land something or other.
Yeah, John, it's the Land Institute, and
the
we'll be in
Land-
touch.
Yeah, the Land Institute. I mean, it's an age-old problem and up in the mountains, and it's not going to go away. And it's not a simple solution, Paul. And I'm really glad that you're attacking it because your dad dealt with it and you grew up with it, and so you understand it. And so if we could come up with a system that was economically feasible, it has to be something you guys can afford to do. And so I know that the reason way back in 75, there were people that had a lot of experience, and I had just started my career, and it was like pulling teeth to try to get somebody to plow up grass that wasn't producing to plant something else. And some of them did it, and it was very successful, and it was worth it, but others just couldn't do it. And I understand, but so however I can help, I want to be involved in the process to help you out. And if I'm not available, somebody on my staff, that's why I listed their names, Paul, you can ask for them, and that way we can, or Phil, we can keep this going and get some answers as quick as possible and try to get come up with a good process. So thank you for asking me to talk, and I look forward to the next time.
Yeah, that's outstanding. Thanks again, Don. Really, really appreciate the time and just the experience you bring to this conversation. Really valuable. Just one reminder that we have recorded today's session, and that will be posted on our website along with those highlights that I mentioned. And with that, we are going to go ahead and wrap it up. Really appreciate everybody joining us today. And if you have any comments or questions for me, just email phil@brinkinc.biz. So with that, we're going to shut her down. Thank you.
Thank you.
Don, thanks, Phil.